From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. Last Tuesday, Saifullah Saipov drove a truck up a New York City bike path, killing 8 and leaving more than a dozen wounded. Saipov is an American green card holder of Uzbek origin. He appears to have been recently radicalized online and declared his allegiance to ISIS. This attack is the first of its kind in New York since 9/11, but resembles similar attacks using vehicles and trucks in Barcelona, Spain, and Nice, France, and other places. And it comes 4 weeks after the deadly mass shooting in Las Vegas that left 58 people dead and 546 injured. With me to discuss the meaning and implications of this latest New York attack is Jasmine El-Gamal, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council who focuses on radicalization and countering violent extremism, and she's joining us from Beirut, Lebanon. Welcome, Jasmine.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me.
And I think we're jealous that you're enjoying Beirut while we're here in D.C., but thanks for making the time. Also with me is Charles Lister, a senior fellow and director of MEI's Extremism and Countering Terrorism project. Good morning, Charles.
Good morning, Paul.
And also Will Wechsler, MEI senior fellow on national security and counterterrorism. And among his many government posts, he was most recently Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Combating Terrorism. Thanks for joining us, Will.
Thank you for having me.
Jasmine, let me start with you. What does the case of Saifullah Saipov tell us about the current patterns of radicalization or online radicalization? What types of threat do they present? And what is changing in this field?
Well, I think that this case is very interesting because of the way that he appeared to just follow ISIS instructions to a T. I mean, everything from the way that he planned the attack itself, the use of the truck, the screaming of Allahu Akbar as he was walking away, the leaflet that he left in the truck proclaiming allegiance to ISIS so that they could get credit for it indisputably. I mean, everything that he did was just clearly intended to showcase the threat that ISIS can pose to the U.S., even though regardless of the amount of territory that it holds, regardless of the success of the military campaign against them in Iraq and Syria. And the threat that poses, to answer the second part of your question, is the fact that, there's just simply no way for law enforcement authorities to find out about this as it is in the planning phase. He was planning this attack for a year, and there was no way to know about it.
Well, Jasmine, let me ask you, just to try to clarify, it seems that he was sort of radicalized by ISIS materials in a kind of generic way, rather than ISIS having been in touch with him and planned it sort of as an operation bilaterally. Is that correct?
Sure, because he was consuming, hours upon hours of video. But the point is, and this is the model that makes ISIS so successful in, at least according to their terms or their standards, they don't have to go out and instruct people proactively. They put out those videos and people come to them and people follow their instructions because their instructions are readily available online. And that is what causes such a huge threat to us, is that not only do they not have to expend resources when it comes to individual recruitment, it's very passive. And so how can we address that? I think that's the huge challenge.
Thank you, Jasmine. Charles, let me turn to you. In Syria and Iraq, where ISIS declared its caliphate over the past couple of years, and certainly with recent developments in Mosul and Raqqa, they've basically lost their caliphate, the capital, the main cities, 90% of their territory, tens of thousands of their fighters killed, including many top leaders. So in a sense, they are being defeated or have been largely defeated. Is there any connection between that defeat and their turning more aggressive externally, or is this just part of an ongoing pattern? Do you see any connection between those two arenas?
Well, just to pick up on the first part of your question, I would push back against saying ISIS has been defeated as an organization, or especially even as a movement. Territorially, they've lost the caliphate that they had, the very real-world caliphate that they've had. But as has been discussed within the terrorism analyst community for a long time, the virtual caliphate, the idea that has been implanted in supporters' heads all around the world, will continue to exist for as long as ISIS is still able to do anything. So
well, let me dig down a bit on that, because that's a very interesting dynamic, let's say. A lot of people said when ISIS first launched its big territorial campaigns and declared the Caliphate and was stunningly successful in doing it, people said it was that success that brought them so many adherents and improved their brand, because even in their ideology, they marketed it as a sign that God was on their side because he gave them these great victories. And the logic of defeating them on the ground was that a defeat, or 90% defeat, would have the opposite effect of the brand being damaged. Is there any damage to their brain, or is it just continuing at a similar pitch?
I think there's definitely damage. I think winning will always spur on more of a threat in the West and in the Middle East and the broader Islamic world than losing will. But nevertheless, having established that reality in people's minds, that is kind of an insurance policy that they'll be able to continue to fall back on. It's kind of insurance policy Al-Qaeda never really was able to exploit. But to bring to your original question about whether or not losses in Syria and Iraq could have spurred on an attack like this, I mean, it's impossible to know. I think what we seem to know about this suspect is that he had decided potentially to conduct an attack as much as a year ago, which would obviously suggest that the losses hadn't spurred on his decision to act. Whether or not he suddenly decided to act because of certain events, we'll never know unless law enforcement tells us that. But bigger picture, attacks like this will continue to be carried out precisely because ISIS is not just an organization that you see on the ground. It's also a movement. It's a brand. It's an idea. And that idea that has been implanted in people's heads will be sustained through all of the propaganda that they have produced and all of the propaganda that, in all likelihood, they'll continue to produce.
Will, it's been 16 years since 9/11. I want to ask you, what's, it's a big question, but how does one assess U.S. counterterrorism and homeland security efforts? Sort of glass half full, glass half empty. There's been no major terrorist attack since 9/11. And yet a guy with a truck can still, ride up a New York bike path and kill and maim a large number of people. There's also terrorist threats like the one mass shooting threats like Las Vegas, and debates about whether that's, what do we use the label terrorism for? Given your service in government and so on, how does one assess this, and how far can that assessment be reliable?
Sure. The overall, as you noted, our counterterrorism policies have been strategically successful. There are, of course, a long way to go, and a lot of challenges still remain. But prior to 9/11, a relatively small number of people had the ability to conduct catastrophic attacks inside the United States, and or a series of non-catastrophic attacks that were linked and continued over a long period of time, sort of like an intifada kind of situation here domestically. It's impossible to imagine that a small group of people could do that today. And it's really even hard to imagine that a very large group of people with state support could do that today.
Why?
Because
of surveillance?
Because of the institutions that we've built at the national level, state level, and even local level in places like New York City. You look at just the sheer size of the FBI's counterterrorism group, the CIA's counterterrorism group, the special operations community in the Department of Defense that are dedicated towards counterterrorism. These are literally orders of magnitude larger than they were prior to 9/11, with much, much larger budgets. And you buy something for those dedications of resources. And what you buy is protection from those kinds of threats.
Well, let me ask you, about that. Given that this attack, in a way, was small and limited, okay, he got his hands on a truck. It wasn't an airplane. He had guns, but they were not actually even regular, real guns. Sadly, he killed 8 people and wounded 12. But is this incident, to your mind, kind of reassuring evidence that, well, if that's all somebody can do, that's kind of reassuring? Or are you less reassured than that?
Well, the challenge has changed over time. Now the big potential threats are what we call Mumbai type attacks, where small numbers of individuals armed with significant small scale weapons, but weapons that can produce significant damage, just go out randomly. And whether that's through a truck or driving through Nice, or whether that's through somebody with a number of rifles from a hotel window, a significant amount of damage can be done, and that's in part because such weapons are easily accessible. But it's also the ideology that's behind these organizations now as they've developed, and the mechanisms that they have to spread this ideology.
Well, let me ask you, as sort of a surveillance or counterterrorism or FBI issue or whatever other agencies are involved, the various sort of terrorist threats inside the U.S., some are sort of Islamist radicalization, some are white supremacist radicalization, some we don't even know what the shooter in Las Vegas was, but a very dangerous threat. From a sort of surveillance or policy or CV, countering violent extremism policy perspective, is the federal and maybe state governments, is it one way of trying to look at these threats, or are they compartmentalized? Or is the Trump administration doing something that compartmentalizes them?
Well, you do have to compartmentalize them at one level because threats come from different sources and need to be tracked in different ways. And whether it's the FBI or DHS, again, an entire organization that did not exist before 9/11, or the National Counterterrorism Center at the Director of National Intelligence Offices, again, two organizations that did not exist before 9/11. They have to look at these threats individually. There are commonalities across all of them. But one of the real challenges that we face is that, when you looked at Al-Qaeda in the old days of Osama bin Laden, in military terms, we talk about the center of gravity, the source of their power that enables them to reach their goals. I would argue that the center of gravity at Al-Qaeda was really its finances that made it different than other organizations that came before it. The center of gravity for the Islamic State, and likely for the organizations that come after it, that are Salafi jihadist in nature, is their religious ideology and the communication systems by which they can promulgate that around the world. And it's
That's an interesting point.
It's worth noting that 500 years ago this week, there was a revolution in information technology that spread a revolutionary religious message and ended up with Europe in flames.
You're impugning Martin Luther.
I am. Right now, we're going through a similar revolution in communication technology. And Martin Luther was not the first person to question some of the teachings of the church at that point. And the Islamic State is not the first organization. Al-Qaeda wasn't the first organization to challenge some more common dogmas, religious beliefs. But they now have the ability to reach, millions of people and directly and really touch those few people that, as Jasmine said, will reach out to them and learn how to become violent.
Thank you. Well, Jasmine, let me go back to you. You've worked sort of in countering violent extremism efforts in the U.S., within communities, whether it's the Muslim American community or others, to try to have communities be more aware of who's getting radicalized. So not from the government surveillance or FBI or Homeland Security. What does this case tell us? Have there been successes that, have happened and this is a failure? What do we learn about community sort of awareness of these issues?
I think that's a really good question, Paul. And I think in this particular case, I was fairly disappointed to read that there was an interview with the imam of the mosque that this guy was going to. And the imam was talking about how he had seen him sort of become more and more radical over time, and how the imam said that he would try to get him to really learn about the true nature of the religion instead of misinterpreting, to no avail. And when I read that, my first question was, well, why didn't you tell anybody? And you obviously saw that something was happening. This is not usual. Most of the cases of community involvement are positive stories where people actually do turn to local authorities or to family members and raise the alarm bell. In this particular case, it didn't happen. But that's one of the only ways that we can really get to the heart of these challenges, especially when you have someone who's radicalizing privately and who may only be revealing his radicalization process to a few close people. We need those people to speak up and to be part of the solution.
Well, would you say, Jasmine, over the past few years, since you've been following this, has community coordination and awareness in the U.S. become more common? Are many communities now aware and involved and sort of, let's say, trained up to do this? Or is it still kind of a notion that really hasn't translated into communal realities?
I think a little bit of both. And I mean, Will can probably back me up on this when I say that it's been a very complicated relationship between law enforcement, particularly the FBI, and local Muslim communities. The FBI, I mean, to their credit, they have been trying to change their tactics and to be more sensitive and less obtrusive, but they have had a very complicated relationship with Muslim communities. And for a long time, Muslim communities across the U.S. felt really targeted unfairly by clumsy FBI outreach efforts, and were very reluctant to turn to them if they saw any kind of problem or radicalization happening in their community. But of course, I would also like to say that this is a fraction of Muslims in the U.S. And so it's not that it's a hugely prevalent issue, but in the cases where it does occur, I would say that there is still some work to be done by U.S. law enforcement to gain the trust of communities across the U.S., Muslim communities.
Thank you, Jasmine. Charles, this fellow was originally from Uzbekistan. And that's, an interest. I wanted to ask you a question about Central Asia and its connection to all these issues. I mean, we hear a lot about Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan. Where does Central Asia stand in this radicalization situation in the region or in the U.S.?
Sure. Well, briefly on that, Uzbekistan, for example, as one Central Asian country, has had a very small portion of its Muslim population involved in jihadist activities for a long time, mostly in Afghanistan and Pakistan. In fact, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, almost all of it pledged allegiance to ISIS, roughly a year ago or so. If we take Uzbekistan as a specific example, there is a clear connection there. In Syria and Iraq, Uzbeks have played prominent roles on the battlefield in ISIS, but also in particular in relation to Al-Qaeda. So there's a relationship there across a number of different Central Asian countries. I also just wanted to touch on the conversation you were having with Jasmine just now to say, the relationship that Muslim communities have with law enforcement is absolutely critical. And European countries have been experimenting and suffering, I think, a lot with the same kind of issues that the FBI has in the US. And, one thing I can say from personal experience, I testified as an expert witness for the FBI last year in Minneapolis, and a significant portion of the local Somali community turned up for the trial, not necessarily in defense of people who were undoubtedly trying to join ISIS, but as representatives of the community. And they saw the FBI as an enemy, not because they were religiously radicalized at all, but because of how they perceived the FBI's actions. And I do think, as has been in the case with some European countries in the past, the FBI appears to have developed, and this is a generalization, but it appears to have developed a strategy of preempting attack plots, rather than allowing the plot to continue up until a point at which the arrest is made. So a lot of the recent ISIS-related cases in the US and related to other groups have seen FBI informants or actual members of the FBI embed themselves and befriend people before they have any interest in plotting a terrorist attack. And then they've actually encouraged them along the way to say, well, maybe you can attack this place, and if you do, well, I can provide you with explosives. And this kind of perception of entrapment is something that in this country right now, I think has been very damaging in terms of encouraging members of the community to inform on people that they know. And as I say, several European countries, and the UK in particular, has suffered from that in the past. I think there are more positive moves being made in some of those Western European countries more recently, but that is an absolutely critical kind of relationship that I think needs to be thought about a little bit more as the homegrown threat continues to exist here.
Thank you, Charles. That sound, there was the alarm of our time running out, so I'll shoot the last question to you. Policy response. President Trump, say one thing, he didn't seem to say much after the big Las Vegas shooting, but he was tweeting very quickly after this New York attack. Put that aside for the moment. What are the policy issues that have been raised by the president or perhaps by others, whether it's about visa programs or other things? What might come of it as decisions from government?
Yeah, I think that the Washington is going to look very closely at a number of the visa programs, especially the diversity visa lottery program, undoubtedly as a result of all of this. It remains to be seen if there, in the end of the day, will be any changes, but there will be a lot of at least noise and actions done on Capitol Hill about that. The other question from a policy perspective that the president raised almost immediately, which is interesting, is suggesting that he be sent to Guantanamo. Mm-hmm. And what to me is
that still open? I
no,
thought Obama was trying to close that down.
Yeah, it is still open. But what's most interesting to me is the president raised it as a trial balloon. The president, said it, and obviously his base probably resonates much. But then very quickly, it seems to have gone away in that the normal processes of law enforcement have taken hold of this case and appear to be moving forward the way one would expect. And that's really to great credit of our judicial system, which has handled many terrorists quite successfully, and frankly has a much better record than the military justice system. And so to the degree that process becomes validated in a Trump administration, I think that will end the long-term debate about the correct way to deal with terrorist groups.
Okay. Well, I want to thank all of my guests today, Jasmine El-Gamal, who joined us kindly from Beirut, Charles Lister and Will Wechsler here at MEI in Washington, D.C. And thank you all, listeners, for tuning in. If you want to post a comment or join a conversation, visit our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/Middle East Institute. And we'll see you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.